Awesome. We can see some people streaming in to the room. Welcome. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to join.
Yep.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Welcome. Just give it maybe a few more moments. You still see people
People are still joining in.
We want to give them the full benefit of the knowledge we have to share.
But we crossed the 50 mark for the attendees for this session. So I think it's good we start. So hello there. Welcome to the Modern Endpoint Management Summit 2022. This is the first ever summit that is being organized by the Modern Endpoint Management LinkedIn group. And a special thanks to all our sponsors who have helped make this possible. You can see them listed on the screen. And sometimes the simplest things mean the most, and in that way, just by being a member to a group, by participating in active conversations within the group, by posting contents, by posting queries, to answering to the posted queries, everything that you all do every day, you all have helped make what this group is today. So for that, we all at the Modern Endpoint Management group will ever be so grateful to you. The MEM Summit 2022 is running parallel sessions in 3 different rooms, and I assume you have seen the agenda to join the session or room that catches your interest. And just for your information, all the sessions here will be recorded and will remain available to catch up later for about a month here on the same platform. And with that, if you're listening to me at this moment, means you are currently in room 1, where fortunately or unfortunately, you are stuck with me and Ben Whitmore for Cloudway for the next 40 to 45 minutes. During this session, if you have any queries related to the session topic, please make sure to use of the chat box that you have access to, and we would try to get them answered at the end of the session. Here's a catch: we would try. We may not be able to respond to all the queries that come in, but we will definitely look after them. And with that, let me call upon my partner for the session here. Room 1, here I present to you Ben Whitmore.
Wow, it feels like I'm at the Oscars. That was a great intro. Thank you, Joy. Good morning. Good to be with you this morning. Thanks for joining us, everyone. As Joy said, it's a privilege to be here and to share some of our knowledge with you this morning. My name is Ben. I'm a senior cloud consultant and I work for Cloudway. And I work with endpoint day in, day out. So config manager, Intune, and also still a lot of on-prem stuff. So hopefully we can share some of that knowledge with you today around PKI and certificates. So it's good to be with you this morning, Joy.
Definitely, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here. And so let me also give a short self-introduction for myself. So I'm Joymalya Basu Roy, but people generally call me Joy in short. I am a senior consultant architect for digital workplace, predominantly working with Microsoft Intune and Azure AD in Atos here. And we will be talking a lot about NDES and SCEP today on this session. And hopefully you all will have something to take out of this session. Yep. Ben,
Perfect.
over to you.
Let's get started, shall we? So
Yeah.
what are we going to cover today? So hopefully you've joined this session because you understand those acronyms. So NDES and SCEP, maybe that's something that you're working with today or you're considering working with, or maybe you just want to understand what it is so you can make a decision when you're considering the options you have to deploy certificates to your internet managed devices. So today, the agenda we're going to go through, we're going to start off by maybe just talking a little bit about why we should choose NDES SCEP over something else like PKCS. So when we're looking to deploy certificates with Intune, there's a couple of options. So we'll talk about the pros and cons of each, the way we see it. This is hotly debated in the world of Twitter. So if you've got strong opinions, share them with us in chat, open our eyes to the other side, and we'll take that on board. Once we've decided on a way to deploy certificates to our Intune managed devices, we're going to go fairly deep, I hope, given time, into the NDES architecture and have a look at how the SCEP protocol works and how we can deliver certificates and all the moving parts that are required to make this whole solution work. Once we've looked at the architecture and looked at the flow and some of the nuts and bolts, we're maybe going to go through some steps to show you how we configure it at a basic level, but hopefully give you enough information that you can replay the session, look at the slides afterwards, and hopefully help you deploy your own NDES and SCEP infrastructure. And at the end, we'll do a bit of a live demo. We'll show you a client receiving a certificate, and we'll show you some of the flows and the logs involved, and talk about some of the stuff that not even we have the answers to. So when we were creating this session, we were talking about, well, what if this happens, or can we do this? And we didn't have the answers. So we're going to just go off cue, and maybe you can join in on chat.
Yes,
and I echo that through the whole session. Just join the chat, ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them as we go through.
yes, and even in this session, like you may hear me and Ben talk about things to which we may not probably have answers to right now. So that's just going through the flow, and hope that's how it is. So Ben, again over
Yeah,
to you.
we're just human, aren't we, Joy? We're just humans who work in IT. We're not robots. We don't know everything.
Yes,
If we
that's true.
did, I'd be doing the lottery. Anyway, we've got a lot to get through. Let's get started. So
Yeah.
So here's a big topic to begin with. Should we choose NDES SCEP or PKCS?
So before we get into that, Ben, what are the options, or like what is the typical use case of deploying certificates from Intune? Like we want to know, like we are getting into this topic of NDES and SCEP. So what's the need for those certificates before we start with that?
Excellent question. So as we said, we see a lot of organizations who are using Intune to manage their devices. Awesome for taking this step into the bold new world of the cloud. But there's often still a requirement to deploy certificates to those devices so they can access stuff on premise still, because you can't lift and shift something you've built for years on prem into the cloud overnight. You're still going to have some stuff that people are going to need to access. And typically we need to ensure the identity of the user is sound before we let them access that stuff on prem. So we still see a lot of people creating VPNs to access on prem still for those legacy line of business apps they can't shift to the cloud. And typically we want to authenticate them with username and password, but also certificates. And so this is where we make a decision on how are we going to deliver a certificate to those devices. Is the certificate going to be used for VPN? Are we going to use it for 802.1x authentication? There's lots of different reasons. The biggest use case I see for certificate requirements still is VPN connections back to on-prem.
Yeah, absolutely. So VPN connection, Wi-Fi authentication to your radio server. There's one more use case typically, that is the SMIME certificates for the email signature and encryption. And these are typically the use cases for that makes us really deploy certificates from Intune. And when we talk about certificate deployment from Intune, then what are the options that we have with Intune?
Yeah, so
Can you just throw a light on that?
yeah, great question. So we need to use something called the Intune certificate connector to deploy certificates to our Intune managed devices. And we'll go through that in a bit more detail as we go through the session. But essentially, when we install the connector, it gives us some options, different ways to deploy certificates to our Intune managed devices. One of those is SCEP, the Simple Certificate Enrollment Protocol. So it's a way to deliver certificates to devices. The SCEP protocol requires, if you're using Microsoft CA, it requires NDES. So this is where we talk about the Network Device Enrollment Service. It's a role under Microsoft Certificate Services, and we'll go through that as we talk about the architecture. But this is one common way we see for people to deploy certificates to their Intune managed devices. SCEP requires a lot of infrastructure, but it is quite simple, and we'll demystify that because a lot of people discount it straight away, thinking it's complex, it's difficult. But it's not. It's like anything. You break it down into its component parts, it's fairly straightforward to understand. The other option we have to deploy certs is PKCS. Again, we still need an Active Directory certificate authority to deploy certificates to our devices. It's a different way. It doesn't require as many moving parts, and we'll dig into that in a bit more detail in a second. We also have the option of using PKCS imported certificates. And you touched on this a second ago, Joy, didn't you, about the use case?
Yes.
For that. So typically, if you want to deploy the same certificate to multiple devices, for like SME email encryption, then we maybe look at that option. The other option we get when we install the Intune certificate connector is certificate revocation. Now, that's not a standalone role that we would use independently. We would use that alongside something like SCEP.
Yep.
So we're able to revoke any certificates if we have any requirements to do that. So let's have a look at, we're making this comparison in this first part of the session between SCEP and PKCS. But let's have a look at some of the advantages, the way we see it, and some of the disadvantages. So with SCEP, the private key is never marked as exportable. So on the certificate template, the private key is not exportable, and I would consider that a safe option when I'm looking at certificates. To me, there are risks if the private key is marked as exportable. Even if we treat our certificates authority, our NDES servers as tier 0, so we're restricting access to them. To me, there's still a risk. I don't know about you, Joy. But Joy's gone on mute.
Yes, no, definitely. Yep.
Do you agree with that?
I do 100% agree with that, and that is one of the reasons why organizations and the security, not the organization, especially the security team, they more lean towards the SCEP certificates rather than the PKCS one.
Cool.
Yep.
See, the ability to revoke certificates as well with SCEP, pretty key. The other really important one here is, and this comes down to your use case really, is certificate requests do not require user affinity when using SCEP. So if you need to issue certificates to your devices during, say, Apple automated device enrollment, and the user hasn't logged into the device, and you cannot have a user affinity at that stage, maybe you need a certificate for 802.1x, then SCEP is your only choice. PKCS requires user affinity. So SCEP is ideal for deploying certificates to userless devices.
Yes.
So what are the disadvantages? Well, it can be difficult to set up securely. If you just read the docs and click without really understanding what you're doing, it can be considered difficult, not to meal joy. And it does require additional infrastructure. So there's a few moving parts, which we'll show in a minute.
And that is what makes it complex, why people go over to PKCS. But at the end of the day, it's really just one server and one rule that you need to configure.
Yeah, it's dead easy. And we'll talk about some template limitations later, about the 3 different templates we can deploy using NDES as we go through the architecture. So PKCS, the advantage though, it's really simple to set up. There's no moving parts. There's literally just the Intune. You have your certificate authority and the Intune certificate connector, and that's it. Very simple to set up. There's also not a requirement for PKCS to publish a URL to the internet like there is with NDES. And we'll show you how we do that really easily and securely with NDES. But that's another advantage for PKCS that some may see. And multiple Intune profiles can target different templates. And there is a limitation on the number of templates we can target with NDES, but again, we'll cover that in a moment or two. The disadvantages, so this is hotly contested on the internet. The private key is marked as exportable and generated on the connector server. So some organizations may see this as unacceptable. The fact that the private key is marked as exportable across the wire to the internet. When this certificate is installed on the end user's device, it is no longer marked as exportable, but some organizations don't like the fact that that key travels, even though it's encrypted over HTTPS, it travels across the internet. That's a no-go for some. So we highlight it as a disadvantage. Anything to add to that, Joy, or you happy with it?
I am perfectly happy with that. And what excites me is the next thing that comes is the architecture.
Yeah, so just keep an eye on the time. So we're going to go through this so we can get to live demos, because we don't want to do death by PowerPoint in the first session of the Mem Summit. So NDES architecture, what do we need? Well, this is Microsoft stuff, so we're going to need a domain controller. We need Active Directory certificate services. We need an NDES server with the NDES role installed. Now, this is not something that you would install in your certificate authority, and it's not something that you would install in your domain controller. So we're talking about a separate server here with the role installed. The Microsoft Intune connector, which is installed on the NDES server. We need a way to publish the NDES URL to the internet so our devices can check into it, and we'll go through that. Typically, you can use a normal reverse proxy for that, or our recommendation is to use the Azure Active Directory application proxy. It's so much simpler to set up. You only need to have 443 outbound on your firewalls when using the application proxy. And we'll show a bit more about why we need to publish that URL later, but certainly consider that. It makes it so much simpler, especially when you're looking at certificates as well, and DNS names on certificates. So they're the moving parts. This is a typical scenario why we see people using SCEP. So up at the top right corner here, we have our VPN user on the laptop, and they want to make a VPN connection into the VPN gateway to access their internal resources. Well, in order to do that, I've got a certificate requirement that my NPS server needs. So I can use my domain controller, certificate authority, my NDES server, and then my Azure AD application proxy to publish that certificate to the user so they can make that internal connection. This is a typical use case, and I see this a lot. So let's have a look at the architecture. How does all this stuff hang together? I don't know if you want to go through this flow, Joy, at a kind of a high level.
Yep. So the high level, as we already mentioned, like we need a domain controller, obviously, because it's a Microsoft environment and the on-premises needs to be a member of a domain. And also you need a domain controller because you need to create the service account in there. Otherwise, the NDES works on behalf using that particular account. And we need to have our certificate services servers. So NDES works with enterprise CA. It's important to note that you cannot make NDES work with a standalone CA. So it needs to be a member server of the domain. And we also need a server which will host the NDES role. Typically, we also add the app proxy, like that's the recommended way of publishing the MSCEP URL to the internet. So we typically host it with the NDES server, but if you want, you can have a different server to host that as well. But it's important to make sure that everything, all the servers remain in the same forest that the infrastructure is pertaining to. So you can't have your CA belonging to a different forest and your NDES server belonging to a different forest. It needs to be in the same thing. And basically this slides is something that I was doing for one of my workshops, is the configuring NDES in as easy as 1, 2, 3, 4. So you see the 4 steps listed out here, but I won't go and mention them all out in here because that is what Ben will do in the next slides. So over to you, Ben, again.
Awesome. Yeah, the great thing about adding this information to the decks is you get those. So you can take them offline and read them.
It's just as an overview that you get at a single view.
Perfect. So we're going to need some stuff to configure this. So we're going to need some accounts and groups set up in Active Directory. We're going to need to create some templates on our certificate authority and change some permissions on the CA as well, so that we can issue certificates and revoke certificates. We need to install the NDES server role and the supporting features for all that role. We've already said we need the Intune certificate connector, and that's something we install on the NDES server. You need Intune. So there's no point in doing any of this if you're not managing devices with Intune. So let's get into kind of 1, 2, 3 steps on this configuration. So the account used to install NDES needs to have enterprise administrator privileges. Okay, you're making changes to your infrastructure, your CA, your hierarchy, so you need to be an enterprise admin. There's also, when we look at the certificates that are issued as you install the NDES role, there's some RA certificates that come from the certificate authority, and by default the enterprise admin has enroll permissions on those certificate templates. So another reason why you need to be an enterprise admin. We just mentioned enroll permissions on the CA templates. So these are the 2 RA certificates that are going to be installed on the NDES server. So the enterprise admin needs enroll permissions on those. We typically create a group that we add our NDES servers to. Now, that is primarily for things like if we want to enroll IS certificates to the NDES server, and we want to enable GPO auto enrollment, then we typically like to target groups rather than individual servers.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just kind of basic Active Directory best practice stuff here. Okay, we need a service account for NDES. And we can talk a bit more about group managed service accounts at the end and how maybe we can secure NDES with a group managed service account rather than a normal user account. But we need a service account, and we need that so that we can issue certificates and revoke certificates. So you're going to need to create that in Active Directory. What we recommend though is this service account, it can request certificates. So consider it highly valuable. It's a high target that people may try to use to get certificates if they're a bad actor. So maybe limit the computers that account can log on to. So in this example, we say limit the account log on to the NDES server and my certificate server. Okay, got a very basic lab, one certificate server. Okay, must be an enterprise certificate authority. The NDES account will need read and enroll permissions on the templates that we're issuing to our Intune devices. So if we create a VPN user certificate, the service account requires read and enroll permissions on that certificate. And in the Intune connector, if we choose to revoke certificates, then we need to give the service account permissions on the CA to revoke certificates as well. Best practice is if you're using NDES, use a separate CA if possible, just to reduce chance of lateral movement if the CA is compromised, or you're not happy with the permissions you're setting at the CA level to propagate across the whole of the CA infrastructure. I'm just going to call this out quickly. This is another reason to use a separate CA. So in the Microsoft docs, they say if you want to specify a validity period on the certificate that is different to the validity period on the certificate template, then you need to set a policy on your certificate authority. Now, just bear in mind that if you read in the docs and you choose to do this, this will affect all certificates that are issued from that CA. So all certificates will be issued, and the requester can modify the validity period on the certificate. So bear that in mind. That may not be desirable. And if you do choose to do that, then that's another reason for choosing a different CA.
The best thing is to avoid that altogether.
Yeah, don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Microsoft have got some really good, and hopefully we can include in the link at the end. They've got some good documentation on how to harden NDES as well. So we follow those best practice, and they actually call that out. So the docs say one thing, somebody else at Microsoft says something different.
Yeah.
But that's cool. Keep it real, man. We're going to need a template to secure IIS communications on the NDES server. So typically we duplicate the web server template, and we give the NDES server group that we created earlier permissions to read, enroll, and auto-enroll that certificate.
This is just a point. So with the new connector here that we have now with Microsoft Intune, it only needs the single certificate, basically with the server authentication EKU for the IIS port 443 binding. But for those who have worked with the old connector, if you remember, there were 2 certificates required. Like you can even have 1 certificate with the client auth as well as the server auth EKU, because installing the connector required a certificate in itself for the NDES policy module. That is not required anymore because of the change in design or architecture by the Microsoft guys. So now it's only the web server certificate that is needed.
Perfect. So we're talking fast because time is ticking. We're having so much fun.
Yeah.
With the to build the certificate name, again, if this is another reason to use the Azure AD App proxy. So the IIS binding certificate, if you're using a reverse proxy, you're going to need to put the external DNS name on the certificate template. On the certificate for IIS, sorry. So you can't automatically create the common name for the certificate when you enroll that. So again, using Azure AD App proxy, it translates the URL. So you don't need to have the external DNS name for your SCEP URL on the certificate template as a DNS name. So again, keep it simple. Use the Azure AD App proxy to publish the NDES URL. It makes certificate issuance so much simpler for the NDES server. And as we said before, we need to give the NDES service account permissions to revoke certificates. So you have to give it the permission on the CA to issue and manage certificates, as we can see here. But like we said earlier, we like to try and not keep things open if we can. So on the certificate managers tab, you can actually reduce the scope that the NDES service account, the templates that it can use, that it has permissions on. So again, the NDES service account and certificate managers just only, instead of allowing it to have permissions across all templates, just give it permissions on the template that you're issuing to your users. Okay. As Joy showed in the overview, we need to add some features when we install the NDES role, and here's a list of them. Take that away and chew that offline. I'm not going to go through them all now. And if you don't want to install it using the UI, you can use PowerShell. Okay, there's a little snippet there that Joy kindly shared with me. We're going to need an SPN. So this is really important. So you need to create an SPN for the NDES service account for web services on the NDES server. So don't forget to do that. It's really important. And the NDES service account on the NDES server needs some local permissions. So it's going to need to log on as a service. You also need to add the NDES service account to the local IIS users group as well. That's very important.
The Microsoft document actually also tells you that the service account needs to be able to have the permissions of log on as a batch job and log on as I forgot that other criteria.
Log on
But
locally and log on as a
yeah,
batch.
but then you don't actually need to do that explicitly, because when you are making that service account part of that IIS service group, that group is already a member of those particular permissions. So
Good call,
it's
Joy.
already inherited.
Good call. Yeah, absolutely. Don't follow the Microsoft docs. No, only joking.
No.
It's good. Just keep sharp. That's what I say. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So we need to install configure the NDES role. So when we configure it, we use the same service account that we created earlier. We target our CA. And so this is when we're talking about those RA certificates. We can add more information during configuration, but it's not a requirement. You can choose to do that. Here's some quick tips as well when configuring IIS for NDES. So we need to increase the max field length for URLs. So we do that in IIS, and also check the reg key as well. I think on server 2019, this may be done by default, but this is something to follow up and check.
Yep.
We need to bind the certificate that's been issued to the NDES server to IIS. That's very important. And this is something what I like to do is just remove port 80 binding. It's not needed, and disable the default document. You don't want people internally browsing to the server and seeing that IIS is installed. To me, that indicates, there's an attack vector there. That server has IIS. So just remove the default document. It's not a requirement for NDES, but it's just keeping things nice and secure.
Part of hardening security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you want to talk briefly about this, Joy, about the template selection?
Yes. So when we configure NDES by default, these are the registry keys that points to the 3 different certificate templates. So by default, the IPsec offline template is used to deploy the SCEP certificates. However, we do configure our own template for that, and you can basically replicate the same template for all the keys here. There are basically 3 keys: encryption template, general purpose template, and signature template. And this is where actually you can, if you play around and you actually create 3 different certificate templates, then from Intune, when you configure the SCEP profile, depending on the key usage that you choose there, like whether it's an encryption or a signature, or encryption and signature both, you can actually deploy 3 unique certificates from the SCEP here. So Ben, over to you.
It's important because if you don't change this, then you're going to be issuing the IPsec offline certificate, and it's probably not going to work. So yeah, really important to do that. So as an example, exactly as Joy just said, here's an example of a certificate template that we want to issue to our users using NDES and SCEP. And so we just use the template name under general purpose, because by default, I think the user certificate that you're going to duplicate in your CA is going to be a general purpose template. It's going to have both signature and encryption key usage on it.
This is basically, you can modify in the template using the key handling, request handling tab, where you get the key usage, like what you want to do in the template part. And then on the Intune portal side, when you configure the SCEP template, you get the key usage. You use the drop down. There are 2 checkboxes like signature or encryption. you can check either or both, and based on your decision. So for example, say if you check both signature and encryption, you are basically pointing to the general purpose template. Whereas if you are pointing or checking out only the encryption and not the signature, then when the request comes and hit the NDES server, it will come and check the encryption template that is pointed in here.
Exactly. So I'm just going to show a quick example on RCA. So in our example, this is the user template we're issuing. And on the request handling tab, we can see that the purpose for this certificate is signature and encryption. Okay, which is why we've modified the general purpose template registry key. So once you've been sitting at home with your coffee and you've gone through all those steps, and you've configured NDES, and you try and browse to the NDES URL, you'll get this. Okay, so NDES server fqdn/srv/mscep/mscep.dll. This will indicate that you've installed NDES correctly. Okay, so we're nearly there now. Last piece of the puzzle is to install the certificate connector to harden NDES, because we want to. So requirements for the certificate connector is we require port 443 outbound to the normal Intune required URLs. We can add a link to that at the end, hopefully. You need to disable IE enhanced security mode in Server Manager. Otherwise, when you try to sign in your Intune account, when we configure the connector, it will all go crazy. Okay. You need an Intune administrator role. You need an Intune license, and most recently, which I haven't put on the slide, the account you use to configure the Intune connector must be a synchronized account. Okay, it can't be a cloud-only account. That's changed.
And I went mad over that while configuring my lab, because previously I used to have my cloud only global admin account to sign into the connector to configure that. But last week when I tried to do that, it never happened until and unless I used or I provided permissions to a synced account to sign in to the connector. So that's a new requirement from Microsoft.
Yeah, don't forget that. So then when we pop across to Intune, so we do this from the NDES server. So make sure you've got Edge installed. You don't want to be doing this in Internet Explorer on the server. So browse to Intune, go to tenant administration, connectors and tokens, certificate connectors, and download the certificate connector from there. Once it downloads, we want to run it as admin, PFX certificate connector UI. And then we go through the configuration wizard. So we choose SCEP and certificate revocation. We choose to run the Intune connector as our service account, and the account you choose here will be the account that's used to revoke certificates from your CA. So when we looked at certificate managers on the CA permissions, we need to make sure these accounts marry up. So we're using the same NDES service account. Can't use a group managed service account to configure the Intune connector service, so just bear that in mind. You can use a group managed service account to harden NDES, IS,
but not the connector.
Not the connector. So we'll talk about that at the end. So you have to sign in as you configure the connector. And then the connector successfully installs. You see the services running under the NDES service account. We see the connector become active in Intune, and we can rename that to something that's more logical. And what this does, this actually hardens the MSCEP URL. So if you try and visit the same URL again, there's a new policy module being installed in IIS that actually hardens that. And you will get error 403 if you try to browse to it. I don't know if you want to give a bit more of an overview of what that means, Joy. Who can actually look at that web page now?
So this is the error is because the request that was coming into the NDES that was being served by IIS previously, which was responsible for displaying that green screen, is now being intercepted by the Intune policy module for the certificate connector. So basically, every certificate request that is coming to the NDES now will be authenticated and validated by Intune service to make sure that the request is a genuine one before granting out a certificate. But this particular error that you are looking at, this HTTP error 403, is actually not an error. It's a sign that your NDES service is working fine.
Just
If you get anything other than this, means your configuration is not good. So you need to
maybe
uh,
one of the common things we see is like having Windows authentication enabled on the default website.
yes, yes. So
So
you
that
can
means
have
some
all kinds of errors from 404 to 500, 501, and things like that. But everything, those are all, like, if we go and speak on that, it will take ages and ages.
cool. So we've got about 5-10 minutes. So I just want to go through some
Yeah.
live stuff. So that's essentially it for the configuration. Just here's a quick tip. So when you're on the NDES server, and I hope you can see this okay, and it's not too small.
Mm, I can
When
see
we
it
go in
good.
IIS, can you see that okay, Joy?
Yep.
Okay, so this is the application pool that is used and is secured with the Intune certificate connector. So here's a quick tip.
So NDES runs within the IIS application pool. It's not something of a different application that is running on the server.
Exactly. So for when you're troubleshooting, the logs in the new Intune certificate connector are a bit sparse. You can see some stuff in the event viewer, but if you want a bit more advanced logging, come into the app pool, advanced settings, and have a look for load user profile. Okay. So load user profile, set that to true. Before you do that, stop the app pool. Log into the NDES server as the service account. So you're creating a profile, log back out of the account, come back in here, set load user profile to true, start the app pool again, and that'll actually create a log file on the box in the user profile directory. So under users, SCEP log file. This is really useful for troubleshooting, and it will tell
This
you.
this log file will be your lifesaver from now on, because
Yeah,
whatever logs we used to get in the previous connector, those connector SVC logs, those NDES policy module logs, they are all gone with the new connector.
yeah.
And it's now all in the events, either in the events, which it's not that very intuitive
No,
to work with.
you get some stuff in event viewer, but as you say, it doesn't tell you a lot. But log files are your saviors. So when let's show an example here of a certificate being issued. So here we have our NDES server. I'm just going to bring up a client. Okay, so here's a client. So here's a client with a certificate that was issued earlier. I'm just going to delete this and do an Intune sync. So if I have a look at my Intune, here's a certificate that I'm issuing. So it's important that when you issue certificates from Intune, you have to complete the full chain. So you have to also issue the root CAs and any intermediates. So you build that chain of trust.
Yeah,
And
the
if you're issuing
trusted
certificates,
certificates.
if you're issuing certificates to users, deploy the root certificates to users. Don't deploy the root certificates to devices and the user certificate to a user, because it breaks the chain. The certificate won't be trusted.
Yeah,
You'll be
because these
troubleshooting that.
certificate stores are different on the devices. So if you deploy the certificate or the trusted certificate to the device, then it's basically going to the machine store. Whereas if you are deploying a user certificate, it will land up in the user's certificate store. And
Yeah,
also, it's important to understand that every platform has their own way of doing the chain making that we call, like, the trust relationship. So where for Apple devices, they can work with the root certificate, but for Android and Windows, they need the complete chain. So if your
yeah.
issuing CA is not the root CA, like it's basically an intermediate CA, then you need to deploy all the certificate of your CAs till the root. that forms the chain basically.
Yep, perfect. So there's my root certificate chained here. I've got a simple setup. So in the SCEP URL, you'll see this in the documentation that you can grab. So here's my URL that I'm publishing with my app proxy. We're not going to cover the app proxy because we just don't have the time in this session. But this is the URL that's published. So I'm issuing this certificate to all my users. So I'll come along to this device. There you go. So my certificate has come down. So if I check the log files for this device, I'll hopefully see in the client log file. So this is in the event viewer under device management enterprise diagnostics provider. You'll see the SCEP certificate request and whether it was successful or not. Just zoom in a bit here. So SCEP certificate requested and generated successfully. That's cool. And I know it was successful because I can see the user certificate on the device. But then if I want to track that through the log files on the NDES server, so I've got the SCEP log tool, and I can see here that it was a certificate was issued, which is quite cool. And I can also have a look at the IIS logs on the NDES box. So yeah, here's one. So here's you'll see 2 get posts. One for get CA caps, or one for get CA cert, and then you'll see another entry for the posting of that certificate by the Intune connector. So we rattled through that at a rate of knots because NDES and SCEP, there's a lot to it, and especially to fit into 45 minutes. So we've covered kind of the basics of what's required, hopefully expanded on what the Microsoft Docs are telling you to do as well. And so there's a lot to take in. Have a look at the slides that are available afterwards and click through this stuff. And I think we've got some time just to do some chit chat, haven't we, Joy? Are we okay for time?
Yes, sure. We do have some time here, 10 minutes.
So shall we talk about, we can go through the flow in a bit more detail on how the flow works with SCEP, or we can talk about some other things that people might be interested in. What do you reckon? I'm looking at questions.
I think we can go through the flow once, because it's also important to understand how the device makes the certificate request to the NDES.
Yep. Okay, so here's one we made earlier.
Yeah. So basically, this slide is from one of my older blog posts, so it may not match with the new certificate connector, but the concept remains same. When Intune deploys the SCEP profile to the device, it also deploys a challenge blob to the device, with the help of which the device will prepare a certificate sign-in request, the CSR, and it basically sends it to the Azure AD app proxy. So if you're using a reverse proxy or WAP, then it will send it to that endpoint, which will redirect it back to your NDES server. IIS will be the receiving end of that. So IIS SCEP pull will receive that request, but it will be intercepted by the NDES plugin module that is part of the connector, which will validate the request if the request is actually coming from a genuine Intune managed device or not. And if the validation is successful, it will go ahead and make the request, the CRP, the certificate registration point, which is also part of the connector. It will go ahead and make a request to the CA based on the template that is determined by the CSR. So in the CSR, you mentioned the key usage. Based on the key usage, it will pick up the template from the MSCEP registry, and using that template, it will make out a request to the CA to, hey, just give me a certificate, which will be on behalf of the NDES service account. So every certificate generated from your CA is on behalf of the NDES service account and not to the actual device or the actual user. And just like how Ben showed, in IIS you get the request. In IIS you also see a post request which tells that the NDES has actually delivered the certificate to the device. But it is to be kept in mind that NDES is sitting in an intranet and the request is coming from internet, uh, relayed by the app proxy. So your NDES server actually have no idea of where to send the certificate to. So and it actually also cannot send the certificate. The certificate basically gets uploaded to the Intune service via the connector, and Intune goes ahead and deploys the certificate on the managed device. So be it a user certificate, be it a device certificate, it will be Intune who is going to deliver that certificate. And field from the notes, what I have experienced, if you have antivirus AV solutions running like Symantec and things like that, sometimes the certificate deployment does not work. As soon as you disable the AV, the certificate shows up on the device. So Windows Defender, I haven't faced any issues, but Symantec, McAfee, yes, they do stop the certificate
Mhm.
deployment.
Yeah, great, great observation. And another one. So this has been mentioned in the questions as well about the group managed service account.
Mhm.
Yes, you can use a group managed service account to run the app pool. So there's a few things to bear in mind. So if I've not actually gone through the setup from scratch using a group managed service account, but you can swing from using a normal service account to GMSA after the fact of configuration. Just keep an eye on the SPN, the app pool identity. Also keep an eye on, and this is a big thing. So the RA certificates that are issued when you configure NDES, does your group managed service account have enroll permissions on those certificate templates? That's
Yep.
and that's an important thing as well. And quite often people will deploy NDES, like, oh, that's working fine. But the RA certificates do expire. So you need to have a way to deal with that. And that can be troublesome. That can certainly make you earn your money. It's not as easy as just requesting a certificate. So
Yes.
you've got the SCEP certificate and
So
the
there
Exchange
there are
Offline
basically
certificate.
two templates which are used for the SCEP RA certificates. One is the CEP encryption template and other is the Exchange Enrollment Agent offline. The CEP encryption template is somewhat easier to renew, but that Exchange Enrollment Agent, which is offline, uh, that renewal will take some work.
Yeah.
So
And
have
if
a
you got an easy way to do it, let us know.
yeah.
Maybe that's a blog post for one day on trying to get that. A bit easier to do. So yes, GMSA. A good friend of mine, Michael Marsall, he's blogged on that at MS Endpoint Manager. So go and take a look at that. But yeah, it's a good shout. I mean, we've taken steps to minimize the the possibility of the NDES service account being used maliciously by. So in Active Directory under the account, we've limited the devices it can log on to, and we've limited the templates that it can issue certificates from, that it's got permissions to enroll certificates for. We've limited the certificates it has management of as well, and the certificate managers on the CA. So there are things you can do to harden your stance using a service account. GMSA is really good. Microsoft haven't blogged on it. It's not in their documentation. So you're going to have to use your experts and your experience in order to put it into place effectively.
Yes. So now we are in a bit of hurry, Ben. So let's wrap it up pretty quick from here. What
Yeah,
do you say?
cool. Yeah, the end.
No, not like that.
It's a great session. We could speak on this for ages. Hopefully, we've put in a lot of good information in a short space of time that's been useful. Certainly take this doc offline. Both Joy and I are on Twitter, so if you've got any questions, reach out. I'm happy to take questions. My DMs are open. We've both got blogs. My blog at msendpointmanager.com. Joy, what's your blog?
So it's in joymalya.com. So it's on my name. You can find it
Awesome.
there. But my detailed blogs on SCEP and NDES are actually out there on the anoopsinaya.com, the previous blog where I used to write. So you
Yeah,
can
I'll
find
pop
it
that in
from there.
chat. I did see that. Pop that in chat. So It's been awesome to run this session with you. First of the day in room 1. Thanks, Joy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me as well to have you as a partner for this session, and I hope this being the first session of the first ever summit that we are organizing, it's a good session for the attendees as well.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, have an awesome day on the rest of the sessions. It's gonna be a great day.
Yeah. So there are many sessions to come in the different rooms that are there, and also there are the booths from our sponsors. So if you're out there, go check out their booths and enjoy the rest of this summit and enjoy all the sessions that you have interest into. So see you again
Awesome.
in some short time. So Ben will have another session. I will also be moderating one more sessions, and we will definitely meet again. And as Ben said, if you have any queries or you want to ask any questions, you can always reach out to us over LinkedIn, Twitter, and you know our accounts, right? So we don't need to share our links of the profiles there. So yeah, please reach out to us if you need any queries or answers.
Awesome.
And with that, it's a wrap up. So we will end up this session. And Ben, it has been nice being part of this session with you. Thanks.
Yeah, you too, buddy. Thanks
And
to the awesome
thanks.
sponsors. Without them, this wouldn't be possible. So this
Definitely.
awesome.
So we have our silver sponsors, Rika Software, Software Central, Medsys, and Mindcore. And we have gold sponsors, Nextink, Acronis, Patch My PC, and Fitian. And also we have a guest sponsor like Microsoft, obviously. We are the Modern Endpoint Management Group. And thank you all for joining in today.
Have a great day.
Have a great day. Bye.